Hi, everyone. My name is Hank Zeller, and I'll be doing my Teach the Book presentation today on the International LGBT Rights Movement, A History by Laura L. Belmonte. So rather than jump right into the book and its arguments, I wanted to first discuss Belmonte's introduction to the book because I feel it adds some extremely important context to where the LGBT rights movement is at today. So number one, as of 2019, 68 of the 193 members of the United Nations criminalized same-sex sexual acts. So that's still today. And only 26 had legalized same-sex marriage. And the LGBT rights movement is a transnational movement that has not always worked in unison, comprised of many different players from individual activists to non-governmental organizations, otherwise known as NGOs. And the author also announces that the focus of the early part of her narrative especially will primarily be focused in Europe, like Great Britain and France and the United States, primarily because she needs to first articulate the need for full legal participation and expression of LGBT individuals, and that's where that began. So the central argument of the text, Belmonte basically argues that the LGBT rights movement was a transnational movement which saw important successes due to global pressure from human rights. However, she says due to the constant ebb and flow of the movement marked by major successes and major setbacks, the equality for LGBT individuals around the world still remains very much uncertain. So chapter 1 is called Origins, and the focus of this chapter is to provide a quick overview of the historic context in which the sodomy laws first rose, and then it also examines the origins and evolution of LGBT advocacy from the mid-19th century until the outbreak of the World War. Ancient civilizations such as the ancient Indians, Chinese, Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all actually tolerated homosexuality. However, the rise of religions such as Christianity, Judaism, and Islam changed this and also created sodomy laws. So several important figures came to play, and organizations also began to challenge these laws and bring advocacy to LGBT issues. One important figure she mentions is Jeremy Bentham, and he said sodomy laws create opportunities for individuals to be blackmailed or extorted. However, harsh punishments for those caught still existed, which execution turning into imprisonment by the 19th century. Walt Whitman, a famous author, also wrote homoerotic poems, and Karl Heinrich Ulrichs and Karl Maria Benkert advocated for LGBT individuals, calling same-sex attraction natural and coining the terms homosexual and heterosexual. Now, the author calls Magnus Hirschfeld, another important figure that she mentions, one of the most significant activists in the history of the international LGBT rights movement. He was the first person to distinguish homosexuality from cross-dressing and then from transgenderism. And through the introduction of the sodomy laws and the description of these LGBT rights pioneers, the author really does set the stage here for the growing visibility of LGBT individuals led by pioneers such as Whitman, Ulrichs, Hirschfeld, and others leading up to the World War in the early part of the 20th century. Now, the focus of chapter 2, called Protest and Prosecution, it covers 1914 through 1945, was to survey how global conflict, primarily for the world wars, during the world wars, brought the first wave of international organizing to a standstill. But it also set the stage for the first mass movements for homosexual emancipation and renewed international activism in the period between World War I and World War II. Much of the early momentum from World War I was halted, but the 1920s brought new energy to the movement. For example, in Austria, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, otherwise known as SHC, organized public lectures to combat anti-gay stereotypes. Once again, Magnus Hirschfeld popped up and instructed homosexuals on how to pass as regular soldiers during World War I, and he felt that this could prove their bravery and overall character if they were able to serve their country during the wars. And throughout this period, he continued to emphasize to homosexuals that there was a need for transnational solidarity amongst them in the movement. There's a kind of this period of ebb and flow here where there would be positives in some areas and negatives in others. For the overall LGBT rights movement. While representation increased through mediums such as literature and film, on the other hand, censorship and increased laws criminalizing sodomy and other homosexual acts appeared. Paragraph 21, a law in Germany heavily restricting homosexual activity, is fought hard against by activists during the period, especially after World War One. And Berlin hosted a conference actually here for the World League of Sexual Relations, who not only condemned this bill, but also called for abortion rights and the legalization of divorce. And this was pretty novel for the time. Um, However, the rise of fascism within the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s targeted homosexuals in an especially harsh way, seeking to round them up and send them to concentration camps during the Holocaust. Homosexual males were actually targeted heavily. However, lesbians were often not, and prisoners were forced to wear pink stars, distinguishing them as homosexuals. The author makes the argument, however, that despite persecution for gay people in Germany and restrictions for homosexuals in the US military, the events of World War II actually forged a sense of solidarity among US soldiers and motivated many to fight discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation in the post-war years. Following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became entrenched in a war of ideologies and geopolitical struggle in what became to be called the Cold War. The fear of communism supported by the Soviet Union led to what was called the Lavender Scare, which Belmonte describes as a fusion of anti-gay mass hysteria and national security concerns that negatively affected gays and lesbians in many Western countries. Since gay people were seen to be more easily manipulated, many were removed from their government positions. However, in what became known as the homophile movement from 1945 to 1965, Belmonte describes an increased fervor of advocacy and activism for LGBT rights. As the movement moved into the 1960s and corresponded with the civil rights era, positive changes began to be seen, primarily due to unapologetic visibility the homophile movement began to show. Great Britain began exploring the decriminalization of private consensual gay intercourse, and the United States actually saw increased laws to decriminalize homosexual activity and expression. And we actually saw a lot of different parallels between the civil rights movement and the tactics used by the homophile movement. Chapter 4, called Liberation and Confrontation, follows the period after the major American civil rights movement legislation in 1964 and 1965, and Belmonte describes an increased form of militant protest by homophile groups and kind of paralleling the Black Power movement that emerged after 1965 in America. In June of 1969, after years of clashes between police and LGBT bar patrons in NYC, police raided a bar in Greenwich Village, leading to several days of protests, riots, and clashes with law informants. And Belmonte kind of makes this connection of Stonewall as the turning point for the overall transnational movement. She says that not only was Stonewall important in intensifying the American gay rights movement, but the incident also sparked the unification of the struggle across many different countries. We see NGOs advocating for global LGBT issues and transnational protests designed to target injustices in specific areas. Great Britain, East and West Germany, and Canada saw the decriminalization of consensual same-sex activities, which inspired activists to push for similar things in other countries. Meanwhile, in 1981, Norway became the first country to end discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. And movements in South America, Australia, and the Caribbean or West Indians also erupted during this time. And this really shows the overall worldwide movement starting to form here after Stonewall. Chapter 5 is called Raging Hope, which covers the span of 1981 to 2000. In the early 1980s, the onset of the AIDS virus pandemic led to discrimination against LGBT individuals, and the overall inaction of the government enraged the gay community. This had a worldwide impact. In a display of transnational solidarity, a candlelight vigil was held in Washington, D.C., which was then joined by similar displays in countries from South America, Europe, and the West Indies. And then a few years later, activists actually marched from Stonewall to the UN, demanding attention for this human rights issue. Several countries took necessary steps to end discriminatory laws, while the U.S. Supreme Court upheld, unfortunately, in 1986, the legality of gay sex. The ILGA, which changed its name from the International Gay Association to the International Lesbian and Gay Association, fought against harsh policies in Middle Eastern countries such as Iran, who were executing LGBT individuals into 1990. The ILGA received status as part of the United Nations as an NGO, but this honor was quickly stripped away due to homophobic lobbying by right-wing US politicians, which resulted in no representation for any LGBT rights organizations in the UN for the next 2 decades. And this is like a perfect example of that give and take that that Belmonte makes in her overall argument. And international LGBT rights organizations continue to attack the UN Human Rights Committee to demand equal rights, and they were really prepared to begin fighting for equal citizenship at the turn of the century. And the final chapter discusses where the LGBT rights movement is at today in the 21st century. Overall, she argues that it's been a mixed bag of advancements and setbacks, making it very difficult to tell what the ultimate outcome of the international LGBT rights movement is. While advancement continued in European countries, predominantly Muslim countries struggled to see progress. Other problems occurred in Spain and Egypt, who were trying to respect traditional values, while Palestinians criticized the Israeli government for advocating for LGBT issues to distract from their other human rights violations that they were doing at this time. LGBT activists called for intersectionality, or the view that all forms of racial, gender, sexual, political, social, and economic oppression are interconnected, and they must therefore be attacked simultaneously. And there were many positives as well that happened during this period of time. For example, an Austrian man in 2003 was granted by the European Court of Human Rights successive tenancy rights when his partner died. The European Union agreed to a sweeping non-discriminatory directive prohibiting employment, discrimination on the basis of religion, disability, age, and sexual orientation. And the ILGA held its first conference in Asia in 2003 as well. Additional positives include Great Britain, Japan, and Germany all enacting LGBT positive legislation in this time. In 2001, the Netherlands became the first country to legalize same-sex marriage, while in 2003, the Supreme Court struck down remaining US sodomy laws. And Belmonte says these victories coexisted with a concerted effort to generate increased awareness of anti-LGBT violence and discrimination around the world. Speaking on this in November 2006, human rights experts gathered in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, where they produced the Yogyakarta principles, which identified pervasive patterns of discrimination and violence against LGBT people, and they made specific recommendations for actions that the UN, states, NGOs, media, and other human rights groups could take to ensure the full equality for LGBT individuals around the world. The chapter also extensively talks about the Obama administration in the US from 2009 to 2017, primarily inspired by the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at the time. And they finally joined with the UN in passing a resolution condemning anti-LGBT violence, discrimination in 2008, while both Obama and Clinton in 2011 took steps elevating international LGBT rights as a priority for US foreign policy. And interestingly enough, Belmonte actually also, at the end of the last chapter, starts talking about how in recent times, Russia, Poland, and the United States have scaled back LGBT rights and have continued to persecute them. And this is like kind of an example where she's saying it's kind of hard to judge the overall movement based on how quickly LGBT rights can be taken away by states. The intervention into the civil rights movement, Belmonte provides the reader with a comprehensive, synthesized look at the history of the international LGBT civil rights movement. While most histories of the movement focus on one specific country or region, Belmonte is really the first to bring it all together and shows how the movements were interconnected. So some interesting facts I learned: authorities rarely prosecuted lesbian couples for breaking sodomy laws the same way that they went after male-to-male partners. And while the Nazi Party in Germany attacked homosexuals, it appeared Hitler was actually more sympathetic than one might think to gay people. His closest advisor, Ernst Röhm, was the only one allowed to call him Adolf, and Hitler refused to get rid of Röhm even when he was publicly outed as a homosexual. Now, Hitler was unbothered by this, and he really only got rid of Rom when SS people tried to frame him as a spy because they disliked his homosexuality. And this really actually sparked rumors that Adolf Hitler himself may have been homosexual, which is interesting to think about. The Netherlands being the first country to legalize same-sex marriage in 2001 really surprised me. I would have thought that that was much earlier in our time. It kind of is striking how recent these rights became, only in one country as well. And I was also very surprised how large a champion Hillary Clinton was. The book actually quotes her in 2011 saying, "Just as I was proud to say more than 15 years ago in Beijing that human rights are women's rights and women's rights are human rights, well, let me say today that human rights are gay rights and gay rights are human rights." And I was also surprised how mixed a bag Donald Trump was on LGBT rights issues. He kind of really tried to portray himself as a champion for LGBT rights, even though a lot of his administration policies, such as the transgender ban in the military and the scaling back of certain Obama policies that had benefited LGBT. Not to mention, he refuses to fly LGBT flags during Pride Month at U.S. embassies. However, he did try to defend LGBT rights at certain points. So he really did kind of play both sides of the issue. Some critiques that I found, I mean, overall, it was difficult to find many critiques in this particular book due to the fact that it was obviously published only a year ago, and Belmonte's work was pretty novel. So she's really praised for her overall synthesis of the time period of the LGBT rights international movement. However, I did find one. The word queer rarely appears in the book, and whenever it does, it is not historicized adequately. This is rather stunning oversight because some scholars would argue that that the very introduction of queer as a political category within the LGBT movement was significant because it intentionally destabilized heteronormative and cisnormative notions of sexual orientation and gender identity. So much so that queer also challenged essentialist identities like gay and lesbian. The sociological implications of these identities are rarely questioned in the book, neither are other problematic notions, such as prevailing human rights discourse around LGBT rights and increasing corporatization of the global LGBT movement. And that was from Kanav Narayan Segal in an Amazon review. And so I added a few other personal critiques that I had from the book because I couldn't find many online. Number one, transgender and non-binary individuals are rarely mentioned by Belmonte, and she seems to just kind of lump them in with the overall general LGBT rights movement, despite them facing obviously some very different issues than maybe a lesbian or gay individual might face. And also, I thought that her failure to mention President Trump's very polarizing LGBT policies and rhetoric in comparison to the previous administration inside the actual text is a missed opportunity to support an argument, as this shows a perfect example of a gain followed by a setback for LGBT rights individuals. She kind of talked about this in her like conclusion at the end of the text, but I'm not sure that everybody would read that text reading this book. So I think that she could have done well to add this into her 2001 to 2020 chapter. So discussion questions that I want to ask. Excuse me. So during the Red Scare and Lavender Scare, many states, including the US, placed restrictions on LGBT immigration due to mass hysteria. I kind of want to ask, does this remind you of anything we've seen in recent times toward other minority groups, and how do we prevent this from happening again? And then the book says that often lesbian women were not restricted or persecuted in the same manner as gay men were. I'm wondering, why do you think that is? I have a few answers from what I read in the book, but I'm just wondering what you guys think might be the answer to that. And then why do you think European countries were so far ahead of the United States in LGBT rights, despite Stonewall being a stepping stone for the overall global advancement of further international activism? Thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you all have a good week. Sorry for the length. All right, have a good day.